Thank you, and welcome back to Suds and Science for our final talk of the season. Thank you all for your support. I recognize some familiar faces, and I appreciate you coming with us as we've changed venues from the Norwich Inn to here, and I hope that is not a long-term thing. I hope we are out of this space for next year. If not me leading the charge, this might be my 9th and final season of Suds and Science. I'm not sure. So it might be somebody else, but thank you for the continued support here. That's been really appreciative. Ticks get a lot of interest, don't they? I think who here has some personal connection to ticks? Yeah, it seems like everybody I talk to is fascinated and interested by ticks. It is so refreshing to have research topics, and we have another tick researcher back, Caitlin McDonald, here. It's so wonderful to have a research topic that people intrinsically get, care about, want to connect to, not physically be connected to, but want to know more about, want to lean in. You know, as someone that has done a lot of esoteric mathematical modeling and working with bird populations in very remote places, it's always like, oh, that's cute, you know, but it's way out and it doesn't affect people's lives. And ticks are something that are right in our backyards and in our homes and on our persons. And it, just from the visceral reaction people give when talking about ticks, I know this is a subject that touches people deeply. If you don't know me, my name is Jason Hill, and I've been hosting Suds and Science for some time now. And you are in the global headquarters, the galactic headquarters of the Vermont Center for Eco Studies here in White River Junction, Vermont, where I live. And thank you for being here. And this is Suds and Science. Again, it's our last talk of the season, and we're going to pick up again probably next January sometime, and you'll check the website for more information about that. I want to thank VCE, my employer, for having us here tonight, but I also want to thank Dan Olson and National Science Foundation for providing funding for tonight's filming services, our good friend Jordan at JAM, and all the crew down there that do an amazing job in downtown White River Junction. You can check out their studio space, check out their offerings on their online channels, great stuff. Terrific audio, terrific video, and great organization to support as well. And without much further ado, and thank you for past support to the Norwich Women's Club, much appreciated, and to Norwich Inn, thank you. And without much ado, I'm really excited and pleased to introduce our ultimate speaker of the season, Joseph Savage. Thank you, Joseph, for being here.
Thanks for the introduction and having me. It's good to be here. I'm Joseph Savage. I'm a second-year PhD student at Dartmouth in the Ecology, Evolution, Environment, and Society program. It's a mouthful, with Caitlin, actually. I just wanted to talk a little bit about myself first before I jumped into things. I'm originally from Portland, Oregon, but came over, Portland, Oregon. Okay. Yeah, but came over here for college at Colby College in Waterville, Maine. Spent 4 years there, and then found my way to Dartmouth for my PhD. And I started off being interested in science, as many do, by just being a dinosaur nerd as a kid. And then took an ecology class in college and really got interested in ecology because it's the main focus of ecology is understanding like the different species that are in the environment and how they interact with each other, and particularly how humans interact with that. So that really pulled me into it. I did my undergraduate work in ecology and computer science. Sort of started thinking about Lyme disease work there, and then I've continued that with my work at Dartmouth. My work is pretty rooted in ecology, but I also pull a lot from climate science, and I'm mostly doing mathematical work at the moment, but pull a lot from also field work from different researchers. I have a lot of broad interests and connections with different fields that I'm excited to talk about. If you feel the need to, feel free to ask me any questions or interrupt me if you need anything explained or have a question, and I'll try to keep myself on track throughout that. But I wanted to start by talking a bit about the history of Lyme disease, then talk a bit about the ecology of it specifically, a bit about what my work is, and then maybe a bit about steps I take in terms of avoiding ticks, if that's of use to you. My work is specifically focused on the ecology of Lyme disease, not the medical side of things, but mostly understanding how ticks work, how the species of mammals and other animals that they feed on work, and how the environment affects all of that, specifically focusing on climate change and land cover change. And if you've been in New England for longer than 5 seconds, you've probably heard of Lyme disease. It's everywhere. I feel like I already knew about it out west, but it really came into the forefront once I moved over here. And especially being at Dartmouth, like in Maine, in a lot of Maine, you don't see ticks all the time, but I had 40 ticks on me last summer in 1 week at one point. But Lyme disease has really actually been around for quite a long time. As a disease itself, it was first described in around 1975. It was first noticed because there was this cluster of cases of juvenile arthritis in the town of Old Lyme in Lyme, Connecticut. That was about like 100% the national average, 100 times the national average, which is pretty crazy. Something else had to be going on, and over the course of about a decade following that, they figured out that it was a species of bacterium called Borrelia burgdorferi, which is a spirochete bacterium. There's various other spiral-shaped bacteria in that genus that cause other diseases, many of which are spread by ticks. Syphilis is another disease that's a member of that genus, or family, sorry. From there, cases of Lyme disease have really exploded. Right now, we're getting about somewhere around 50,000 cases reported a year to the CDC. But the number of cases that are treated based off of insurance claims range as high as 476,000 cases per year. So the number's probably somewhere in between those, probably on the higher side. But the disease has really grown rapidly since that first cluster of cases that was really identified. But the disease has been around much longer. Back in museum specimens of mice and ticks going back into the 1800s, they've tested them and found that they've tested positive for Borrelia, the pathogen that causes Lyme disease. By the way, from now on, I'll probably just call it Lyme. That's referring both to the pathogen itself as well as the disease that it causes in humans. But also, if you may have heard of Otzi the Iceman, a natural mummy that melted out of a glacier in the Austrian Alps. He also had Lyme disease. They tested his blood, or body remains at least. So that was a case from 5,000 years ago. So Lyme disease has been around for a long time. It's not new to the scene, but what is new is its rapid expansion. And that kind of comes into play in terms of the ecology and where a lot of my research interests lie with it. So that's what I'll talk about now. So one of the biggest things about Lyme disease in terms of trying to understand it that researchers first really focused on was the ticks themselves. The blacklegged tick, or the deer tick, is what spreads Lyme disease in the Northeast. Out west, there's another species of tick, also called the blacklegged tick, but the western blacklegged tick, that also spreads the disease. And over in Europe, there's the sheep tick. They're all part of the same genus of ticks, and broadly have similar life cycles, but there are some differences between them. But I'll just focus on the black-legged tick here, since that's really the important one for this region. But that tick has a 2-year life cycle, during which it goes through various different life stages. So larval ticks, larvae are the first life stage of ticks. They hatch out sometime in mid to late summer. And then will search for something to feed on to drink their blood. Usually a small mammal like a mouse or a squirrel is what they'll be going for. Those ticks will then drop off of that mammal, which is called a host, and overwinter. So they'll basically crawl down to the leaf litter or right near the soil and hide out the conditions until the next year. Until usually around this time of the year in the spring, when they'll molt into, or come out as the next stage, which is nymphs. That is the life stage that is thought to be the most important for spreading Lyme disease. They're still really tiny. Larvae are even tinier than nymphs. Nymphs are about the size of the head of a pin. But by that point, they have fed on something, such as a mammal, which may have had Lyme disease, which means they can spread it to you if you're bit by one. And because they're so small, they're often hard to notice, which can mean that they go unnoticed, and then you can not take them off and catch the pathogen. But those nymphs will find their host, drop off the same as the larvae did, and then molt into adults, which then later that same summer will do the same process over again before they overwinter and lay their eggs the next year. So that life cycle is pretty complicated in itself. There's a lot going on in terms of how ticks are able to survive in the environment. There's factors such as the temperature and the humidity that influences how many of them survive each day. And then obviously the whole complicated part of them having to progress through 3 different life stages, find 3 separate mammals or birds to feed on. And that's really ecologically interesting in itself. But the host that they feed on also, yeah.
Is that a microphone? That you
Yes,
put on?
yeah, but it's not.
Can you
I can
put
speak
it
up though.
Can you put it up higher?
It
doesn't do that.
amplify in the room. It just records to the
Oh, okay.
cameras.
I can speak louder though, if that works better.
Yes, please.
Yeah. So the hosts, the animals that the ticks are feeding on also become really important. Deer were the species of animal that was thought to be the most important when researchers first started trying to figure out how this disease really spreads. That is why deer ticks were known as deer ticks. It was thought that deer were the primary host that ticks fed on. But we came to understand that that's really not the case. While deer are important, there's a lot more different hosts that they're also feeding on. And like some of the reasons that deer were thought to be important were just the fact that deer are really large. So they have a lot of blood and a lot of ticks can feed off of them. And additionally, deer are also moving around the landscape. They're not just staying still in one spot, so they might be bringing ticks around with them as they move. But a lot of the studies that were conducted were done in a way where they would effectively either remove all of the deer from a small location, such as an island, or just reduce the numbers of deer that were in a location. And they really found that that didn't have that much of an effect on the number of ticks that were out in the environment. In some cases, it may reduce the number of ticks a little bit. In some cases, it just meant that more ticks were feeding on mice or other small mammals. And I'll talk a bit about why that poses another part of the equation here. And the other thing they found was that when there was a small amount of deer, they do serve that purpose really well of feeding a lot of ticks, which then means you have a lot of eggs from adults, which are primarily feeding on these large deer. And then you have lots of eggs that hatch into larvae and then complete the life cycle. When you have a ton of deer, it doesn't actually seem to boost that number too much. So while deer are part of the puzzle, they're definitely not the final answer to why Lyme disease started spreading a lot and why cases have become so prevalent. And then the next mammal that people really started thinking about was mice. And part of that is because mice are really good at transmitting Lyme. About 90% of ticks that feed on an infected mouse will get Lyme disease and be able to transmit it to a human when they bite it, or another animal when they take their next blood meal. So the number of mice that is in an area has a really strong effect on how much disease you expect to be actually in the tick population itself. But that's still not the whole story, because mice are just one of the many mammals that are out in the landscape outside that are feeding ticks. There's all sorts of other small mammals like shrews or chipmunks or raccoons that ticks are also feeding on. And one of the things that really becomes important with this is that all of those different animals have a different ability to actually transmit Lyme when a tick feeds on them. Deer are about completely unable to do anything in terms of transmitting Lyme. Pretty much no ticks that feed on deer will catch Lyme because deer don't really get Lyme. Whereas mice are really good at getting it. All of the other hosts sort of lie on a spectrum between that. So one of the next real areas of research that people focused on was understanding how all of the different mammal species that are out in the environment are influencing or deciding how much disease you expect to exist in a region. This is called effectively the dilution effect, whereby when you have lots of biodiversity, so lots of different species, since on average they're a little worse at transmitting Lyme disease than, say, if you had only mice, that reduces the disease risk. So it's one way in which maintaining biodiversity might actually help protect us humans from disease risk, but it's been pretty hard to actually pin down in experiments if this effect really exists. Partially because it's hard to control a bunch of different animals that are just living their lives. It's not as simple as just running a study and hoping everything works out, because there's a lot of different compounding or different factors to consider that are interacting with each other and can really mess up any data. So on top of that too, there's also predators, which are eating mammals such as mice. And we've removed a lot of the predators from the Northeast over time, which also has an influence on potentially how many are being eaten, how many are actually seeking out areas or interacting in areas where humans are. So animals themselves are a huge complicating factor in this system. And then the final real piece is the environment itself. In particular, there's the landscape and then the climate. So the landscape has a big influence on disease risk because it influences what hosts can actually live in an area. And in New England, this becomes particularly important potentially in how Lyme disease has started spreading so rapidly recently, because most of New England was actually deforested up until the mid-1800s for raising sheep. And this removed a lot of the habitat that species such as deer and mice actually needed to survive, which meant that there was actually, potentially the reason that you didn't see as much Lyme disease was because there weren't enough hosts for ticks to actually feed on and maintain a population. So as New England has reforested since the 1850s, you've seen that habitat open up for species such as deer and mice. And in particular, in the past 50 or so years, the forests of New England have really been cut up into smaller patches instead of like large continuous forests. And that creates a lot of like edge habitats on the edges of forests that are the perfect habitat for species such as mice, which are really good at transmitting disease. So that's thought to be one of the primary reasons why disease prevalence has increased so much. And in addition to that, humans are also, when they're moving into the forest and expanding developments, are moving into those habitats where they're actually interacting with the places that mice are living and that ticks are able to actually attach to you and find you. And then the big factor that a lot of my research focuses on is climate change. Since the life cycle of ticks is actually really influenced by the climate, if you're a tick, I don't have much sympathy for them, but it's a hard life out there. Temperature and humidity are particularly important factors. It influences what times, how many ticks can actually survive over the course of the year, but also influences, for example, how active they'll be in terms of trying to search for hosts. Humidity is a particularly important factor in that because ticks will dry out if the air is too dry. And during those times, they have to stay under the leaf litter to hide from the environment, to hide from the elements. So that can really influence when you'd expect them to be crawling up into places where they might interact with humans, and also the host that they need to feed on to actually produce a population. Temperature is a particularly important one, especially thinking about it in New England, because long, cold winters force ticks to overwinter and try to survive that. And when temperatures are too cold, they both can't go looking for hosts to feed on and also can't really survive that long. So even in like the past 30 or so years, a lot of New England has, tick populations have established because winters have warmed particularly fast in this region, which has been a big factor in why Lyme disease has expanded rapidly northward to the point where all of New England is now has established tick populations, and it's moving up into Canada. And that's expected to continue because things are going to keep warming. Another factor that we're trying to think about in terms of my research is also snow cover. New England has had much more variable snowpack in terms of like how much of the region is covered in snow during the winter, but also how long it is covered in snow. If you think about this winter, like we didn't have snow. Well, we had some really early snow and then almost no snow until late in the season. And there's some different ways in which this might impact ticks because when they're hiding out in the leaf litter over the winter, the snow cover might actually provide an insulation of some sort to them. So as we lose snow, it's possible and some research has indicated that might have a negative impact on them because now they're exposed to those winter conditions that they normally would be insulated from. But some of that isn't necessarily all the way clear, and I'm hoping to explore that with my work. So all of these pieces in terms of like the life cycle of ticks themselves and the hosts and then the environment are really sort of all of the driving factors in terms of what I'm thinking about with my work. And I'm particularly interested in understanding what the future of Lyme disease will look like. We've had this rapid expansion. All signs point to that this massive change has been a part of that, and since it is continuing, it's likely that will continue as well. But we don't really know, and we don't have a necessarily good way of predicting that. So the technique that I'm using for my research is to create basically ecological simulations that are capable of simulating the processes that, for example, a tick has to go through to survive. That technique is specifically called process-based modeling. It's a lot of scary math that I can mostly ignore, which is fun. I don't like math any more than probably most of you do. But effectively, what you're trying to do with a process-based model is model the processes that an organism needs to do to survive, as well as how the environment's interacting with things. So with ticks, for example, they need to molt between life stages, and that might happen at a specific rate depending upon how fast they find food. They're also going to be affected by the environment as they do that. For example, when they're trying to find hosts, if it's too cold out, they probably won't be doing that. And when it is warm enough for them to be doing stuff, they'll be happening at a specific rate that we have determined based off of experiments. And really, you might not know all of the different processes or factors that are going on in a system such as Lyme disease, but the goal is to represent as many as we can of the important ones, and create a representation of reality that can be used for making predictions, more naturally than just estimating or using just purely a statistical estimation based off of data that we already have. And all of this data is really driven by field experiments and laboratory experiments that have determined how the tick life cycle works, how fast they are able to find hosts, or how well they're able to survive at different temperatures. So even though this model isn't actual reality, it's very much based in what we know about how this reality works for ticks. And for my work, I'm working to create this ecological model to simulate tick populations in the Northeast, and then also how prevalent disease is in those populations. And the thing that I'm really hoping to do is to create a model that can work over the entire Northeast. And in particular, my plan is to consider all the different environmental factors that are actually affecting ticks. Because most models that have been made before haven't really been able to consider all of those different factors, partly because when you're trying to answer a specific question, say, how does temperature affect tick survival? You'll just focus on temperature, because that's an easy way to simplify things and not get too messed into the weeds of all the science and math. Ugh, math. So my goal is to actually try to incorporate all of these different factors, because if we are trying to create a more holistic estimation of the future, you do need to consider all of these different factors that are changing in unison with each other. I'll be pulling in effectively lots of satellite data on terms of what temperature and humidity looks like in the region, and also what snow cover and the landscape is looking like, because that allows you to really get a sense of how the environment is changing over the entire landscape of not just a single location, but the entirety of the Northeast and all the states here. And another thing that's really lacking is that most ecological models that have been made are really focusing on a single location. So you might be predicting the number of ticks that are happening, or the number of ticks that you'd expect at a region like White River Junction right here. But it's not really broadly applicable to knowing what populations look like at the whole landscape scale. So my goal is to actually run that. It requires a lot of computing power, but one of the benefits of being at Dartmouth is we do have a really good computer system that can actually run all of that. I've definitely crashed my own personal computer trying to run some of this, but I now have the resources I need. So there's sort of three parts to the research that I'll be doing. The first part of it is really actually creating the model. That's mostly a lot of coding and making sure that I've done all my math right and that there aren't any mistakes there. But it's also a lot of reading through literature, looking through what other scientists have determined about how tick populations behave and what the different survival rates are, for example, with temperature. And another piece of that will be actually evaluating the model, because it's one thing to create a simulation and say, oh, this is how the world works, but you want to compare it against actual data. So what my lab has done is contacted and worked with various state agencies in the Northeast and different universities and researchers to compile all of their different data sources on how tick populations have expanded or behaved over time. We have data from not all of the states in the region, because Massachusetts doesn't actually collect long-term data on tick populations, and Rhode Island doesn't seem to as well. But we've collected data going back to up to the 1980s for some states, but for most states it ranges from a few years to maybe a decade or so. And we'll use that to compare against the simulation that I create to make sure that it's actually representing reality roughly right. So this will allow the model to actually predict, or hopefully allow us to say that it is predicting things somewhat well. And then the actual research that I'll be doing with this is to simulate what historical Lyme disease expansion has looked like. Even though we know that cases have been increasing of Lyme disease in the past several decades, one of the things that would be interesting, or that is needed to know, is how exactly temperature or climate change has been impacting that expansion. So one thing that you can do, or that I hope to do with this model, is to simulate what historical expansion has looked like. And then, because I have this simulation, you can effectively turn off climate change. You can simulate the model assuming that there was no change in winter temperatures over time, and really start to tease apart how these different factors have impacted the expansion of Lyme disease and disease risk to humans. So with that, we could understand how important that factor really is, because we don't necessarily have a sense at the magnitude that each factor has had in terms of the expansion of Lyme disease. And then the really important part is understanding what the future will look like. The biggest outstanding question is, will Lyme disease prevalence keep increasing? Will it go down? Is it going to reach some stable point and then stay there? We don't really know. So the goal with this basically is, now that we've represented how the ecology of the ticks is working, we can bring in climate science and climate models specifically that are predicting what the world will look like based off of uncertainties that we know about how the world behaves and how the climate behaves, but also potential paths that we might be on depending upon how much carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases we continue to pump into the atmosphere. So I'll be working with that climate data to effectively run the model over what the future might look like. So that will mean giving it temperature data and humidity data from those models to simulate what futures might look like. And for that, we'll also be bringing in data on what land cover might change, how land cover might change as well as we continue developing the landscape and changing the landscape. So with all of that change, we'll be able to potentially predict what different scenarios of Lyme disease risk might look like depending upon how we adapt to climate change. And then hopefully the model will also be useful for predicting management strategies that might be useful for mitigating disease risk, as well as preparing us for adapting for what might come of that. So that's the sort of the general overview of my research and what I'm doing. If anyone has questions on that, feel free to ask. Yes. And then I can also talk a little bit about just protecting yourself from ticks in general, and what I do with that. Do you have a question?
To what extent can you blame suburbanization for the spread of Lyme disease? It would seem that it certainly facilitates the kind of habitat that would be receptive to it.
I think, I don't know that I would be able to say an exact number in terms of how suburbanization has affected that, but as we've really cut up forests and created weird little edge habitats where there's lots of brush and scrub, that has really increased habitat for mice and the species that are spreading Lyme disease a lot. So that's definitely had a big impact, and also brought humans closer to the habitat where ticks are actually living.
How about other diseases that the ticks are starting to spread? Are you going to look at that and if they're kind of just beginning in our area, wouldn't that be something to look at too?
Yeah, so that data set that we'd collected also looks at a few other diseases that are in the Northeast that are spread by ticks, including anaplasmosis and babesiosis. For my research at the moment, I'm just focusing on Lyme disease because it starts getting even more complicated the more pieces you add. But the modeling that I'm using is extendable to other tick-borne diseases more broadly. But that would probably be much further down the road.
By then, it'll be all blossomed.
Yeah, a lot of those diseases are a lot less prevalent in ticks. Yeah, at the moment. And the data is also a lot.
Does the same tick pass on all those different diseases? There's something like 12.
Actually, last I read, there's over 16. They just
Yeah.
discovered another.
There's something like
it's the
70
same.
diseases spread by ticks in the Northeast, or in the United
It's
States.
The
Yeah.
same type of tick that spreads
No,
everywhere.
so not all diseases are spread by all ticks. I'm forgetting the exact list that is spread by blacklegged ticks, but there's also the American dog tick, the Lone Star tick, which spreads alpha-gal syndrome, which causes you to be allergic to red meat, for example. A lot of those ticks are moving north, especially the Lone Star tick, into this region. And then all of those ticks sort of spread their own different hosts of diseases. Yeah.
Isn't anaplasmosis much more common now? I mean, I hear many more cases of it, and I'm wondering whether it just maybe was misdiagnosed before. Is that expanding? I mean, you hear about it now almost as much as Lyme.
Yeah, cases are definitely expanding in it. I don't know the exact numbers. The research is a lot lower on that one, I'd say. Yeah.
We had, at the Budbee last year, we had someone from Vermont State come out, and he said that they keep track of all the ones that are reported, and as of June last year, he said of all the cases of tick bites that were reported, 11% had Lyme, and 33% had anaplasmosis.
Interesting, yeah. I'd heard of some research out west, too, that found a few spots where there was like some absurd number of ticks that had anaplasmosis in them. So, yeah, there's a lot of other important diseases.
More dangerous, it's supposed to be more lethal, and everybody's like, oh, Lyme, and he was saying, yeah, that's going to be like you wish you had Lyme, because if you get anaplasmosis, it can do some horrible damage to you.
So can Lyme. It can cause, especially if it's untreated or you don't catch it early. It's also a complicated disease because in the early stages, it really just mimics every disease. The symptoms are being sick, effectively. So yeah.
When you're looking at contagion, are you looking only at people, or are you looking at like dogs?
So I'm not explicitly looking at people even at the moment. The way that my work is looking at disease risk is really looking at tick populations themselves as a measure of risk, because the more ticks are outside, the more likely you are to run into them. Yeah. But yeah, dogs are a big factor as well. They do have a vaccine for dogs, which is helpful.
Why don't they have one for humans?
There's one in stage 4 trials. They had trials in New Hampshire recently, but shut them down. So,
All right.
How about, because my daughter-in-law's really into ticks, not wanting them on people or things, and she has some place where I guess you have to pay, but it's a pretty nominal fee. But if you have any tick, you can send it to them, and then they send your doctor or you, it doesn't have to be both, the report. And she sent a couple of them off, and they've come back with both diseases, Lyme and the anaplasmosis on it. And she does that, and I was like, well, if more of us do that, maybe that would be helpful.
there are a lot of labs that offer tick testing like that. I know one of the precautions is that sometimes it takes a while for them to process them, when you'd be better off probably going to a doctor to check things out. Yeah.
Knowing the doctor too, but I mean, you go to the doctor too, and I guess the doctor has said to my daughter-in-law, the only thing it's going to help is knowing that those ticks around you have those things, but for this moment, we're going to treat this.
Yeah.
But I would think that some of the sort of the medical data is incomplete because, I mean, many of us will have ticks and we'll take doxycycline, which is amazing. And it's like, so you don't go to the doctor, or you don't even have to go to the doctor to get doxy, and it's just like, it changes the database, I would think. We never get reported sometimes.
Yeah. So disease, like the case numbers that are officially reported too, it's also like optional reporting, which is why 50,000 is probably a pretty low number. But then also on the high end, it's potentially over treatment, because oftentimes it is just in case they'll give you the antibiotics just to make sure, because the risk of getting it is so much worse than having to take the antibiotics. So yeah, the data is definitely skewed, but the fact that it is increasing is certain. Yeah.
Yeah, so this turns us into a little different area. Maybe it's not your area of expertise, but like I'm out in the woods a lot, and I'm like walking, and I'm trying to be really conscious. So obviously, if you're walking through like a field of high grass, that's a very high risk situation for ticks. We know that, I think.
To some degree. Wait, I can get to that. I can get to that once you finish
Oh,
your
you're
question.
coming to this?
Once you finish your question, yeah.
Well, what I'm thinking about as I'm walking is where are the ticks? And I'm use a lot. If you're on a just designated trail, that's well established, you're probably not going to get any ticks because you're not brushing up against plants if you're really conscious about it. But I'm in the woods, so I'm thinking, okay, are they in the leaf litter? Okay, are they on the ferns? Okay, are they on the trees? If you brush up against a tree, could you get them from the leaf litter climbing in onto your footwear? Where, that's the kind of level of detail that I'm really interested in.
Where are they?
Yeah. Generally speaking, in terms of where ticks are mostly, is actually in like the edges of forests where there's more shrubs and things like that. There's often a lot fewer ticks when you're deep in the woods, and also often fewer ticks when you're actually in meadows or like open grass.
Really?
That's not to say there aren't ticks, but they really do prefer those like edge habitats of forests. And in general, ticks, for blacklegged ticks at least, they're not going to be in trees and they're not going to jump on you. They're usually lower down towards the ground, maybe climbing up sticks, especially the adults. So they might be up to potentially like waist height on average. Sometimes they'll get higher than that. But yeah, brushing against vegetation is often the best way to catch nymphs and adults. But they also still are in the leaf litter, and I've definitely picked up ticks on myself just from walking in leaf litter. So I think the best way to prevent ticks is to do a tick check. Yeah.
So I thought, and correct me if I'm wrong, wherever she is. I thought in places like Monhegan, because there aren't any deer on the island, that there weren't any ticks there. But what you're saying is the deer isn't necessarily a vector there. Is that correct? Was I understanding?
Yeah, so the deer aren't actually like a host for Lyme at all, so they aren't important there in that sense. But also ticks can feed on anything, so it's not just deer. So if there's any mammals or birds and things, a tick population could sustain as long as there's enough to feed on.
Mm-hmm. We have Ted Levin has written about white-footed mice is what he has said and what he's written about. In our area, is your research seeing that too?
I mean, white-footed mice are definitely one of the most important small mammals. Yeah, but then also there's all sorts of other small mammals too, such as shrews and chipmunks. So
and they
yeah.
can carry them just as much?
Yeah, usually a little less well. Chipmunks are more like, I think 40 to 60% of ticks that feed on an infected chipmunk will catch it, whereas mice are more 75 to 90. Yeah.
And what about like mice biology makes them such like a better vector compared to other small mammals?
That's definitely out of my wheelhouse. I don't know. There's definitely a lot of small mammals and animals that can just catch lots of diseases and just let it do its thing, and that's how they survive as like a strategy. But I don't know specifically on mice.
Do you have any studies at all on using tick tubes?
No, I don't. Jason might know more on that.
Yeah, I've talked to him about that.
And using what?
tick tubes.
Yeah.
I went to a tick talk, and the guy's name was a tichologist from UNH, and he said he absolutely swears by them. And you just take cotton balls and you spray them with the permethrin and let it dry, and then you just, all winter long, I saved my toilet paper tubes. And you stuff them in there, and then when I stack my wood, I put them in between the logs, and they love that. The white-footed mice for their nests, and within 1 or 2 weeks, they're all gone. And when I'm bringing in the wood in the winter, every single tick tube is empty. And I don't know, is it helping? I don't know. Can it hurt?
I've seen some studies.
They're all empty, and I must put out over 100 balls.
I've seen some studies that say they could work.
Because they put them in their nest, and then because the contact with them for so long, it gets in their fur, and it stops the cycle. Is that right? It stops the cycle?
It kills the ticks.
Yeah.
I've heard some studies say that it could work. The one thing you want to be careful with, though, is that permethrin is toxic to cats. So if you have cats...
I have 5 cats, but they never go out.
Yeah. Well, that's better then. Yeah. Because it can affect neighbor cats. Yeah.
So
I have a question, Joseph, about your model. Can you help us visualize what this model is like? Is it like a Sim City type thing where you have millions of actors who are programmed to behave in a certain way if they meet a certain temperature and relative humidity condition, or is it a series of loops and interactions, in an iterative process?
It's more like the second option, so it's mostly just everything is a rate. So a certain number of ticks will die every day. No tick is its own individual in the model, though. And then a certain number are born, whatever, depending upon how warm it is, a certain number of ticks will actually be active to look for a host. But then it's also a model that extends over the entire Northeast. So effectively, you're modeling at every given point, for every kilometer of the Northeast, at a single point, it's modeling what's going on at that location based off of the local temperature and humidity from satellite data. Does that kind of get at your question?
Yeah. It's not an individual agent.
No. Yeah. That would definitely break the computer. Yeah. Yes.
What do you think is going to happen with Lyme disease? Like, do you expect Lyme disease to increase just sort of based on what you know? Or do you think that like tick populations are increasing, and with that subsequently the disease will expand sort of along their northward expansion, or what are your hypotheses?
I think it will keep increasing because the percent that seem to be infected is under the amount that you could expect from how many mice you see in the landscape. Effectively, the upper number of what percent of ticks you'd expect to be infected is about the percent of total mice. So potentially 90%. That would be all ticks feeding exclusively on mice. Based off of the average number of hosts we see, it doesn't seem like we're at the maximum percentage. It's somewhere between 20 and 30% in a lot of places in the Northeast. So I'd expect that it would keep increasing until it reaches that threshold. But I think that threshold will also keep moving depending upon how we're changing the landscape and what host populations look like.
So you're saying 20 to 30% of the ticks actually carry the Lyme disease?
Yeah. And that's the nymphs themselves. So every time they feed, they have another opportunity to be infected again. So adults often are infected at upwards of 50 to 60% of adults will have Lyme disease.
Is there any evidence that Lyme or the threat of Lyme affects how people care about the environment or about spending time outside?
That I don't know about, actually. I don't know on that one. Yeah. I think it's definitely of concern because you go to any state park here and there's always a sign warning people about ticks. So I'm sure that has some impact, but I don't know if there's been a lot of research on that, at least that I've been aware of.
I was just thinking I should hire one of the neighborhood kids to rake one.
Well, it seems like a lot of people
That's
don't
something
want
we
to go
can
out and do more careful. I mean, some of us who spend a lot of time in the woods, it's like, just do it and check. But some people, I've heard of it, it's anecdotal though, right?
It's a valid fear. It's a horrible illness and easy to miss a tick, even if you are super vigilant. So, yeah.
I think it'd be interesting to know how the people who are blowing all the leaves versus raking all the leaves, what's happening to the ticks in that situation? All the leaves are in.
That would probably be very bad for the ticks, I guess, depending upon where they got blown away to. But that's speculation.
I'm wondering, I'm thinking about the research that's being done with mosquitoes to genetically modify them so that they're no longer as good at carrying diseases like malaria. Do you know, or have you heard of any research that's being done with ticks to see if we can genetically modify them and then release a bunch to the population to, so that they're no longer as good at vectoring?
I haven't heard about that. I think it could be a bit hard with, maybe mice. I know there's been some research in terms of like administering medicine or vaccines to the animals themselves. But ticks are a little different in terms of compared to mosquitoes because they have to feed on an individual host. And when they're breeding, they have to like randomly end up on the same host, a male and a female tick. Whereas with mosquitoes, it's more that like they'll breed in bodies of water. So they're all kind of congregating in one spot, which is how the genetic like gene drive of that works, I believe. But I don't know, it could be possible. It might just take a lot longer.
Yeah, you'd have to get all the hosts.
Yeah. Or understand like how the hosts are spreading the ticks to like optimally place the gene ticks, alter ticks. Yeah.
I think your focus has been in New England, but didn't you expect that there would be a huge spread in the Northwest and other places? I mean, it's there, right? So, I mean, isn't it inevitable that it will shoot up there too?
Yeah.
Environmental conditions different enough that maybe it was less likely to spread.
Yeah, so the environmental conditions are pretty different. Pretty much the entire West Coast also has Lyme disease to some extent. There are ticks. They don't seem to bite people as much, partially probably because they don't actually quest or like look for hosts high enough up to like run into people as often, partially because the summers are so dry that it's too dangerous for them to actually go up that often. And potentially also tick populations might just be lower. I don't know, I think there's also a bit of a lack of data on it because it is so scarce in terms of how much Lyme disease is spread out there compared to the Northeast and other hotspots, that there isn't as much research on it. Yeah, but the environmental conditions are definitely a big factor in that.
Going back to kind of like the gene modifying, like what, I was trying to think of like what sort of things that like humans can do to manage the landscape in order to kind of quell the spread of Lyme disease. So you mentioned biodiversity protection and then like mitigating climate, or not mitigating, but like lessening.
I mean, potentially restoring like actually expansive plots of forest instead of just like the way we have our forests all in like little parcels could be a part of that. And then also potentially biodiversity could be a big part of it as well. Especially we've killed a lot of predators off in this region that may have helped control populations of the hosts that are spreading Lyme particularly well. So those might be two ways that we could try to do something about it. To some degree though, with like the environmental conditions that we have and the fact that it has already spread now to the entirety of this region, eliminating it's probably not an option, but there might be ways to reduce how prevalent it is.
Are the predators you're speaking of like coyotes?
Coyotes, mostly wolves, were completely eradicated from the Northeast. Other predator populations too are not doing great, and they're often also interact with each other in terms of like coyotes and foxes, for example, will exclude each other from different areas. And with their different diets, that can have impacts on how many mice are eaten, for example. So.
You just bring a lot of cats around.
Well, then the birds would all go. That's a hard problem.
So if you're thinking like a tick, I'm a tick and I want to get a mammal. and I want to position myself to maximize that possibility. So you said they might be down in the leaf litter, they might be up on a branch, they might be, they're looking for different hosts, and how much are they moving around, or are they just staying in one place?
So they'll usually mostly move around when they're trying to like go down to hide again in the leaf litter, or maybe to get some moisture back. But generally when they're actually looking for a host, they'll find like an exposed spot, such as on some sticks or tall grass, and just sit there with their legs outstretched, their front legs, and then sort of wait for something to brush by that they can latch onto. So
It's for my dog to walk over.
yeah, exactly, yeah. So it's kind of a passive way to search for hosts, but they just kind of sit there with their little legs going out.
But are they thinking big mammals, little mammals, what are they thinking of?
For adults especially, they are looking for larger mammals because smaller mammals don't really have enough blood for them to feed off of. So they'll often be higher up when they're actually looking for something to feed off of, whereas smaller like nymphs and larvae are mostly just looking for anything with blood. So they'll often be down lower, which means they often are feeding on mice, but they still do feed on deer.
So higher up is like 2 feet, 3 feet?
Anywhere from like even just above the leaf litter to probably like shoulder height even. Yeah.
To what extent are the winter ticks that do so much damage to moose involved with the spread of Lyme disease?
None at all, actually. Yeah, not at all. They don't spread Lyme disease. It doesn't seem like they even necessarily spread disease to moose. They're a bit of a weird tick, though, because they don't actually search for 3 separate individuals to feed on. They attach to one moose and then go through their whole life cycle on that moose until they lay eggs and drop
So that's
off.
a completely different species.
Yeah,
than what we're talking
different species, and also particularly different life cycle. And that's also why they can hurt moose pretty badly, because if a moose walks into a patch where there's a lot of larvae, it'll get so many ticks on it, and they can start draining a lot of blood.
I mean, it's shocking how much blood they're taking. These, we had a lot, moose have been through cycles. I mean, we didn't used to have any moose around here, and then we had a lot of them, and now we don't have hardly any, because of those ticks. And, I mean, how many ticks would it take to kill a moose? But they're out there.
Whatever number it is that's doing it. Yeah. Do you have a question?
Yeah, how does a tick know it's a mammal?
I don't know that they know that necessarily. Well, so in terms of if they just randomly latch on to something that's walking by, they probably are mostly, it's moving. It probably has blood.
Are they kind of heat-seeking?
They, do you know, Caitlin, on the heat?
Yeah.
They can heat seek,
Yeah,
I
they
think.
do like,
Yeah.
like they have like chemosensory, so they'll look for like CO2
Yeah.
or like sweat or heat or vibrations. They have all those like really sophisticated sensory organs actually in their 2 front legs. So.
Or it could be AI.
That would be a wild surprise.
Yeah. But some of that does come into play more when you're moving slowly or sitting in a spot. So oftentimes I think, or at least I would expect when something's rushing by, like I've run through grass and gotten ticks on me, I don't think they caught any CO2 for me in that case. But it could influence once they actually get on you if they decide to feed or not. Yeah.
Were you going to give us some tips about what you do to...
Yeah, if you'd like, if that'd be helpful. I mean, for myself, mostly, like, I like to tuck my pants into my socks. I'd recommend wearing long pants and long socks pretty much anytime you're going to be outside. Even if you're thinking you're not going to be wandering around in the woods or leaf litter. The first tick I ever had that bit me was just in a parking lot. Randomly got a tick. And so, like, tucking your pants in is really important. I will often use permethrin on some of my clothing if I know that I'm going to be out in the woods and just want to have some extra level of precaution. But that has its own disadvantages at times because it is a toxic substance. And generally, the most important thing is doing tick checks. When I have my pants, like when you have your pants tucked in, it forces the ticks to pretty much be on the outside of your pants. They can't like sneak under. So that can be helpful in like not letting them get into weird nooks and crannies that you then have to search for. I'll often just check my pants while I'm outside regularly to take any ticks off me before they even have a chance to go finding spots. But then doing a tick check later, like making sure you check like armpits, groin, just everywhere, back of the knee. That's really the most important thing. You can pair that with a shower. It's not a good way to remove ticks that have already attached, but it could potentially help rinse them off if you missed them. But like really the biggest thing is, no matter what you're doing in terms of like layers of precaution, is checking for ticks. They're sneaky and they find a way. Some people will also put like a layer of duct tape reversed around their calf, so that if ticks try to crawl up, they'll just get stuck. There's a lot of tricks like that. Yeah, but tick checks are really the biggest one.
I sprayed my shoes, socks, pants, everything the other day, and I pulled a huge tick off of my arm. And I was talking to an old Vermonter, and I said, yeah, and I tried doing all the stuff, and I tried to do everything right, and he said, that is the biggest bunch of bunk. I'm an old Vermonter, and let me tell you what you do. You get as naked as you can. He said, because then you can see them. He said, you're all covered up, and you're tucked in, and all this stuff, and they still seem to be able to find a way in. He said, if the less you have on, the more easily you're going to see them right away, or you're going to feel them.
That could be a strategy.
I would never have thought the opposite, but it kind of...
I would say generally whatever works for you is fine, as long as you're also doing tick checks still.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, the light clothing too. If you're wearing jeans, just forget it. You're not going to see them.
Well, actually, they did a study on that.
Well, just to be able to see them, not necessarily are they attracted to them.
They had done a study to look at clothing in terms of the color, because they thought potentially ticks might use color in some way to find hosts, especially for maybe the undersides of deer being light colored. And I don't remember if they actually found a difference in terms of the color there, but they did find that people could actually find ticks as well on dark clothing as light clothing. I think that some of that depends upon your own eyesight and whatnot.
I was going to say, how many have cataracts?
Yeah. There may have been some biases in the study. Yeah.
It's also been recommended, if you know you've been out and in a place and spots where there are ticks, when you get home, take off your clothes, throw in a hot dryer.
Yes, definitely.
For 20 minutes or whatever.
I always do that.
You do that?
Yeah. They can't really stand being dried out well at all. They can last a really long time without food.
That they dry out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a good way to get them out.
Going back to the color thing, I'm imagining like people with like darker skin like might have like a harder time finding them. Have there been studies to show that like people of color have like higher rates of...
I don't know on that. I know there have been some studies in terms of diagnosis, partially around the rash that you can sometimes get with Lyme, because often that gets missed because it doesn't show up as well in dark skin. But I don't know on the actual ticks in terms of attaching and whatnot.
How fast do they move? I mean, if you got one on your boots, how long would it take you to get it to your head?
Ooh, I don't know an exact number. I mean, it could be anywhere from a few minutes to hours.
It could be pretty fast.
Deer ticks are pretty methodical, I feel like. They're pretty slow. They're not trying to bite you really fast. So I've had them take like a few hours to get up all the way at me. But then some ticks, like dog ticks, I've had like crawl super fast. Like it would take probably 30 seconds to get up you and bite. I've had some bite me within less than 15 minutes just being outside. So it kind of depends upon the tick. Deer ticks are usually fairly slow, and they wait out for a good spot.
And are deer ticks and blacklegged ticks the same thing? I guess.
Yes. So blacklegged ticks are the same as deer ticks. They were originally called that because people thought that deer were the most important host. Yeah. And then wood ticks, winter ticks are moose ticks. There's a lot of ticks with different names that all overlap.
How about if you catch mice, if you catch them in your, trap them?
What about it? Like?
Well, by...
Oh, like removing them from your property?
Yeah, I'd say if you trap them in your attic or in your, wherever you're gonna get them. I guess most people have those little boxes, but I guess I go for, snapping out of here.
It could possibly remove the amount of ticks you're exposed to. Often they're house mice that are in houses rather than white-footed mice. Well, they probably could still eat some ticks. Yeah. I don't know that it would necessarily be as effective though.
But at least they won't eat up your stuff or.
Yeah, I think you wouldn't have mice to begin. Yeah.
I would like to thank our speaker, Joseph. And thank you for being here at the Ultimate Suds and Science of the Season. Hope to see you in 2025. Safe travels, folks.
Thanks for having me.